Okay, hello and welcome back. We are going to talk about Chapter 8 on rhetorical situations. I am pleased to report that the last group has now selected their subject. So we've got a lot of people talking about visual rhetoric in one way or another, be it through iconic images, which I think might be too small of a topic. You may want to expand a little bit more, hint, hint, or just basic visual rhetoric. We've got lots of people who want to talk about memory, both public and collective. And then we got like an old school pentad, which is great. I definitely like over this next, over the days where I'm like saying we have time for one-on-ones and things like that. And also like if you pop me an email and like ask for recommendations, I've definitely got some recommended types of things that can get you started on some of this, on a lot of this research too. But the first place that you should get recommended reading from is from your textbook. At the back of every chapter, there's a notes section, and in those notes sections, there's a lot of citations for places there. Pardon me, places where they're drawing their research from, and so that's always useful. I would like to give a quick shout out to anyone in the Young Americans for Liberty group that might be in the audience, because I realized that like with online learning together, we have beaten the dry campus rule. So here's one. There's one out for y'all at Young Americans for Liberty. The rhetorical situations. All right, this is like the brainchild of Bitzer. The Bitzer is what we'll be doing as our next annotation, which is good. And we will talk about people who also don't agree with Bitzer, which is also good and fun as well. I am getting ready to share our PowerPoint. Really hate this PowerPoint. Color scheme, not the best. So yeah. There we go. All right, rhetorical situations, chapter 8, right? We've got some components to rhetorical situations, but before we even get into that, the book reviews some items that we've talked about before. They talk about these three different types of discourse: the deliberative, the forensic, and the epideictic, all right? Deliberative discourse, concerned with the future, concerned with what we want to do. It's about policy making, right? And how do we come together and create policy for create policy for not only governance, but like coming together to make any types of decisions where groups of people have to make decisions on what their next course of action is. One of the examples of this where like you got to see deliberative discussions in action live on television was the before we even get to that, what is a deliberation? There are some certain things that are required for a deliberation. One is that everyone has to be free to exchange their ideas, right? You have to feel like that no one's going to like hurt you or in some way for expressing what your idea might be. Otherwise, it's not a good deliberation, right? If people are like holding back, then you defeated the purpose of having all these minds come together. Second is that it requires honest interlocution, all right? You have to be an honest participant in a deliberation. You can't go in there willing to like lie about your positions in order to win something. Winning is not the point of a deliberation. Deliberation is about coming to the best possible decision for the group. You have to also enter a deliberation with the desire to satisfy the needs of all competing interests, right? So like I said, like you don't want to win. You're trying to like please everybody, right? As much as you possibly can. And also effective deliberations use consensus building rather than voting. Big thing about any group projects and things like that is you never, never, never want to have a vote on things, because anytime there's a vote, someone loses. There's lots of different consensus building tools. Like I know that I address like usually my favorite one in COMM 170. But yeah, like things like the Fister 5 method, where you're like expressing how much you are with or not with the group on a particular decision, and then having lots more talk and deliberation and meeting of the minds in order to satisfy people is a good way to build consensus instead of having a vote that splits. Okay, those are what happens. Those are the things that happen in a good deliberation. And public deliberation is not a super common thing, right? Like you'll see people speaking in Congress, but are they really doing a public deliberation, or is a lot of it like grandstanding? And like that's something that we're going to talk about right now, right? In American politics, like when Obama was in office, instead of like just like pushing as hard as he could to like pass a single payer healthcare plan, right? He came up with the Affordable Care Act to try and like give concessions and things like that. And he had major public deliberations live every day. And it was not just on C-SPAN, like these were carried by the major networks, where he literally had Republicans and Democrats all sitting at a table together, and then all expressing like what their problems were with the bill, what they wanted to change, what they wanted to do, to try and have this type of give and take type of thing that was going on. Let's see, is this going to work? Oh my goodness, it is. So you see them all at a table together, right? This is basically what it looks like. I'm going to fast forward because like this is hours and hours that they were doing this every single day.
I've already indicated some statistics, but I just want to reemphasize this. More than a quarter.
What is that noise? Wow.
Small businesses.
Anyway.
Reported a premium increase. I don't hear opinion, but
so there's Harry Reid, right? He was Democrat, but the Republicans had just as much time to speak on this subject and everything else that was going on as well. And it was interesting to watch, right? Because they were trying to do this public deliberation in front of America. Now, did it work? Good Lord, there is something. I'm sorry, I have to pause this for a second. Okay, I'm an idiot. It was running inside the PowerPoint as well. So that's where all that background noise was coming from. At any rate, easy to see these Healthcare Summit videos. They're still available on C-SPAN or on YouTube. Yeah, let me get back to sharing that screen again. There we go. And we'll start from current slide. All right, excellent. Yeah, so did it work, right? The answer would be no, it did not work, right? The American Affordable Care Act was still one of the most contentious pieces of legislation passed during the Obama presidency, or probably like in the last 20 or 30 years. It was just a big mess in like how it was executed, and as well as like how it like reverberated through the politic, right? A successful deliberation would have had everyone leaving that table somewhat satisfied with the things that they've like come together for. They would have had that consensus. They never got that consensus out of these deliberative talks. So why was it not successful? You can speculate however you want about the honesty of the people who were approaching the deliberation. You can speculate as to whether or not they really had a desire to meet the needs of everyone else at the table, right? I'm not gonna like play, I'm not gonna like, hindsight is always 20/20, and I'm not gonna like even like delve into that, right? Other than the fact that like it wasn't a successful deliberation. So this is like an example of what not to do. So moving on. Forensic discourse. Forensic discourse, like a deliberative discourse concerned with the future, forensic discourse concerned with the past, all right? The roots of forensic is involved in speech and debate, right? Which is like where I work, speech and debate, and the comm department. The speech and debate, like their concern was with finding truth. It was originated in the law courts. We've talked about this in the beginning, right? So it's like it's concerned with the past because it's all like what happened, right? What really happened? Like we have to have a court case to determine like whether or not this person did something, whether or not they were guilty of a crime. So these are all things that have to do with the past. And apologia is a part of the defense in courts as well. So when we look at things like apology rhetoric, which would have been a really cool one for a group to do, but that's okay. Then that is a part of that, part of forensic discourse. And lastly, we have epideictic discourse. Epideictic discourse is the ceremonial. So toasts, eulogies, introductions, commencements, receiving an award, inauguration speeches, political convention speeches, all have to do with like the epideictic. They talk about it as speeches of praise and blame. That's a common way that people describe it, but we've seen in other pieces of work that like that's really like it doesn't seem like they always are praising or blaming in this type of discourse, but I don't know. It's still a part of the attachment to what we call epideictic. And rather than the future or the past, it has to do with the present, right? It calls upon the past to inform us of what we should do in the future, but it doesn't set out a policy proposal. It's about reacting to a particular situation that's going on now. A rhetorical situation, wink, 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 right? So now we're getting to this idea of like rhetoric being situational, right? This is where Bitzer comes in. For Bitzer, he says that like situations produce exigencies, right? And he defines it here. Exigencies are an imperfection marked by urgency. It's a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be, right? Something is amiss. Something is weird. Something happened. And so it calls for rhetoric to respond. And it is the situation which dictates what rhetoric should be is appropriate to use as a response, right? Eulogy is a really good example of this, right? What's the exigency in a eulogy? Well, someone's dead, right? Someone's dead, and like so there's very high emotions, and like people are like, well, what do we do, right? Because like old Billy Tyler or whatever, whoever is like now kicked the bucket, right? Got the Rona or something. No, that's bad. I'm sorry. But yeah, so like someone has passed, and so like the rhetoric that is called upon is a eulogy, right? Something really good happens, like people are getting married, right? So the rhetoric that is called upon is for the best man and the maid of honor at a wedding to make a toast, right? So these are exigencies, an imperfection marked by urgency, right? Like, wait, a wedding is an imperfection? Well, in some respects, but no. A wedding is marked. It's marked by urgency. It's a situation that's going on where like it's imperfect to not have that toast, and like that toast is the thing waiting to be done. Okay, small groups, we're not going to do that. Awesome, great. You can like they talk about thinking of like I talked about thinking of like times that like you might have had an exigency that called for rhetoric. Like the book goes through some really good examples of this. I think we should watch one of these speeches too, because it is one of the great speeches that we've ever like experienced. Well, no, you haven't experienced it. I did, but we'll watch it as well. Yeah. So exigencies pop up all the time that call for rhetoric, right? So like the Challenger disaster was an exigency that called for rhetoric. 9/11 was an exigency that called for rhetoric. And you can see the book looks at very different approaches as to like how rhetors responded to that situation. So moving on. Constraints is another part of the rhetorical situation, right? So like, sure, like there's an exigency, something is calling for rhetoric, but like we have a certain amount of constraints, right? There's only so much that we can do. There's only like so much certain things that we can and can't say, right? The 9/11 example is really good at thinking about constraints, right? So what could George W. Bush say and not say in response to 9/11, right? He can say things that are, he was very careful and like smart to be like, yeah, we're gonna smoke the evildoers out of their holes, right? Because like there's a situation that calls for the populace to be ready to go to war. But then on the flip side, he had to like also constrain himself and say like, look, this is not a war against Islam, right? Like Islam is a religion that is a peaceful religion. We are not out to get Islam, right? So that is a constraint that he had upon himself, where he had to make sure that he was like not trying to like trying to offend like Islamic people, right? So constraints, they constrain symbolic action, they constrain the rhetoric, they can arise from the exigence, arise from audience, identity issues, which is exactly what George W. Bush had to deal with when he was like saying like, look, we're not trying to like go after Islam as like an identity or anything like that. That's not what we're about. Legal issues can get in the way as well, right? Sometimes you'll see a company that may have done something that might have been bad, right? But the public relations person can't go out and apologize for the thing, because that would be accepting responsibility on the behalf of the company, and that's a legal constraint in how they can react to certain situations. So if you're looking to be a public relations professional, legal constraints is very common to how you can respond in a crisis situation for crisis communication. And then we have fitting responses. So we have an exigence, we have constraints. Oh, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but like yeah, okay. Before we get to fitting responses, we also have to consider the audience. Apparently, like one of my quiz questions was for this chapter last time rather than the prior one. But the rhetorical audience, there's a definition of rhetorical audience in here. An audience that consists of those persons who are capable of being influenced by the discourse and being the mediators of change. So if you can't be the mediator of change, then you're not a part of the rhetorical audience. All right, that's how Bitzer defines it, right? Now, is that unfair or something like that? It doesn't matter, because like he uses this definition in order to say like, this is the part of the audience that I'm talking about, right? It's not a slight against people who are unable to be the mediator of change. It's like saying like, this is what I'm talking about. This is why I define it this way. So if you like the quiz question said, if you're hearing a political speech but you are not allowed to vote, if you like you're a felon or like from another country or something like that, then you're not a part of the rhetorical audience. You can't really do much. So audience is another thing that can constrain rhetoric as well, right? And audiences also like not only constrain rhetoric, but like also like they have their own set of agency. What can the audience do as a result of rhetoric? Okay. All right. Fitting response. Like, so this gets into like what we call genre analysis. So we have all these methodologies for analyzing rhetoric, right? We can analyze a piece of rhetoric under a feminist lens, or we can analyze a piece of rhetoric under a lens of like race and to like critical race theory or something like that. Or we can like look at a piece of rhetoric under a neo-Aristotelian, looking at Aristotle and like ethos, pathos, and logos as a way to analyze a piece of rhetoric, right? Genre is another way that we analyze rhetoric. Like the more we do a certain thing, the more certain characteristics will pop up in a rhetorical form, right? So like when we're doing a toast, there are certain things that happen in every single toast that like by the end of the toast, you know that the person is going to lift their glass in the air, or their bottle in this case, right? And like, that is how they're going to toast the person. You know that in a eulogy, you're usually paying tribute to the person who is gone, right? You're not like dogging them, right? You're not like saying bad things about them. So genres help to like create like categories of rhetorical responses, right? Um, and yeah, like as a method of rhetorical analysis, like a genre analysis would like describe the genre that a piece of rhetoric or that a rhetorical situation would call for, and then look at the rhetoric and say like, does this fit the genre? Does it not fit the genre? What did they do? Right? Does this make it effective or ineffective? Does this teach us something about the genre itself that we don't know or that we didn't know? And these are ways that like a rhetorician might look at certain speeches or other types of rhetoric. Following a genre can be effective, right? Like a eulogy, if you give a eulogy that pays tribute to the dead, like that's effective. But also not following the typical genre response can also be effective. I believe John Cleese was giving a eulogy for one of the other people in Monty Python. And yeah, he did like say some disparaging things about the person, right? In jest, right? Because it was a comedian. It was an occasion where a lot of comedians were there. So even though it didn't follow the typical eulogy genre, it was effective due to the audience, due to like the constraints that were there and things like that. So not following the specific genre was very effective in that particular type of situation. Okay, now we get to all this stuff that Bitzer says, right? Bitzer. And then this guy Vats comes along and he's like, yeah, everything that you just said, Bitzer, it's horse. It's not correct. All right. So Vats flips the whole script on Bitzer. All right. But little side note about Vats, he's kind of funny in that like he is an openly conservative scholar in the communication field, which is very unusual, but like not super uncommon. He's like he actually, him and a few other people pretty much got a part of our listserv destroyed because like the rhetoric on the listserv was so inflammatory. And these are all communication scholars and things like that, like PhDs and like grad students, and like grad students wouldn't touch these conversations because there was like, what is going on? Anyhow, Vats is like a spitfire, right? And remarkably arrogant, incredibly arrogant. Now, a very, very accomplished scholar, but super arrogant. Like this is his textbook that's on the screen here. Like the title of it is The Only Authentic Book of Persuasion. I mean, come on, right? And so the agenda spin model, I don't even know what it is. He talks about it so much, and like he got so tiresome that like literally I don't think most anyone knows what his agenda spin model is, because like we've just gotten really tired of him, which is very unfair to Vats. But it says something about like the idea of like people are not robots, and so like yeah, sometimes our emotions like make a difference, and like how we present ourselves makes a difference. Anyway, so Vats says like it's not the situation that creates the rhetoric, Bitzer. Rhetoric creates the situation. And everyone's head explodes. And like the thing is though, is that like in a lot of respects, Vats is correct that a lot of times it's the rhetoric itself that creates the situation, because like it contextualizes the situation. It says what the situation is, right? Gettysburg is a good example of this, right? Where like there is an expectation of a speech to talk about the war, and Lincoln said, that's not the situation. I'm going to redefine it. And I'm going to say like, look, the situation is actually talking about like the greatness of our country and like the obligations that we have in order to maintain this country, right? It's not about the war, right? It's totally about something else, right? That flips it around and says like the rhetoric changes and contextualizes how we view the situation. Now, what does this sound like? Then I'll tell you what this sounds like. This sounds exactly like the type of argument that Plato and the Sophists would have. And the conservative Vats is playing the role of the Sophist, which is like really cool. And like, yeah, Bitzer is playing the role of Plato, where he's like, no, there's these objective events out there that are like, that are situations that call for rhetoric. And Vats is like, no, there is no objective event. It is rhetoric that makes that event exist in the first place, right? And because like without rhetoric, what is the event, right? There is no event until we describe it. Very, very sophistic in like the thinking in this case. So in response to fitting responses, or I'm sorry, not fitting responses, but like ways that we can respond. Oh yeah. Flips the script, situations rhetorical, utterances invite exigencies, right? Like the wedding doesn't exist without rhetoric in the first place anyway, right? So the toast is an exigency that is based on the utterances that have happened prior, right? When she said I do and the other person said I do, right? Then that's created an exigency. And the Silent Spring example that they have in the book was pretty good too, where they say like sometimes there is no situation until there's rhetoric, right? Like we didn't know the effects of like these pollutants like DDT, right, as an insecticide, and what they were doing to the planet. And so the rhetoric comes out that says like, hey, look, I'm like showing you like the environmental damage that's going on, and now a situation happens after that. Right? Climate change is a good example. Like the IPCC creates these reports and things like that based on like these events that they're seeing, but it's not really a part of the public vocabulary. It's not really a part of the public civic mind until the rhetoric distributes that information all over the place. The IPCC being the the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yes. Or international panel. I don't know. So yeah, that's the deal with like VATs. And in a lot of respects, like I kind of side with VATs, but you could certainly say that there are other times when, you know, something happened and like the situation happened that calls for rhetoric too. But it's an argument that you can take a side on. Responses to rhetorical situations, right? We have these differing types of responses that we can take. We have conformity. That's the conventional response. That's like what you would expect to hear at a certain rhetorical situation. Someone's dead, I expect to hear a eulogy. Great. Non-participation. That denies the legitimacy of the situation in the first place. Like, so if you just like go along and say like, yeah, like this isn't a rhetorical situation, or the situation, like I'm not going to participate in like the thing that you expect me to. For the non-participation, they talk about the LA Clippers and like when their owner said some really racist and bad things. The rhetorical situation was for them to perhaps not play their basketball game, or actually the rhetorical situation was for them to like play the basketball game because it was a playoff game. And so they non-participated in the idea of the game by obstructing the symbols of the LA Clippers on their uniforms. And they said like, look, we're not participating in this. We're just here to play basketball, and we're doing it for the city of Los Angeles, not for this organization. Desecration, that would be a violation of the expected response. It challenges our expectations. And then contextual reconstruction, that's basically like Lincoln on the Gettysburg Address, right? That we're going to redefine what the situation is. And these are different ways that we can respond to a rhetorical situation. Yeah. So I'm going to like share one other thing. We're going to stop sharing that. And we're going to share something different. And we're going to, I don't know if we watched this in class. I don't think we did, but this is This is the eulogy for the Space Shuttle Challenger. The reason why we watch it,
the C-SPAN network.
The reason why we watch it and analyze it a lot in rhetorical courses like ours is because it was like a really unique situation. It wasn't just that a space shuttle blew up, right? Space Shuttle Columbia blew up, right? Like that, it burned upon reentry, and we never really like analyzed what was said by the president or anything like that in response to that, or at least not so much. This particular one there was a lot of things going on at the same time. First, the State of the Union was supposed to go on that night, right? That got canceled. Second, there was a civilian school teacher on this spaceship, and when it exploded, there were like millions of school kids across the country that were watching it live, because like it was a school teacher on there, so like all these kids were watching it. In fact, like there was a young astronauts program going on at the time too. Like I was a part of it. So like yeah, like space shuttles and things like that, like people were they were watching those things. They were very interested in it. And so like he has like this difficult job of like comforting NASA, who's like was being constantly attacked for delays, and like congressional like funding was being threatened, as well as dealing with the American people and how they were reacting to this, and dealing with the school children themselves. And he has to address all of them in this speech. So this is just a really, really good speech. I don't care about your opinions about Reagan as a politician or as a policymaker. I certainly have my own opinions about that too. But this as a piece of rhetoric was really, really good. And we should watch it real quick.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, overcame them, and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave. They had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. Future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program. But what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews. Yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades. And we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and the historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning. They prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
That last line always gets me. I always get a chill up my spine. It's from a poem about the Air Force, actually. But yeah, slip the surly bonds of earth and touch the face of God is like a very poetic way for him to end that speech. So that is all that I'm going to have for today. We have one more chapter coming up. And it's about publics and counterpublics. So I know one group should be very, very interested in that chapter. You will have a Bitzer annotation due. You will send those to your group leaders like before, and they'll do the appropriate grading. And I continue to try and catch up on grading. It's just been a very rough few days, but we're getting there. And the Roll and Thay things were put in your grade book now, and I'm starting to look at those discussion board posts. I'm starting to be very interested in some of the things that you've got to say, and like the way that you're treating each other with your responses is very, very cordial. Like, I really like your response. That was really good and stuff like that. That's really cool. I like that. So yeah, keep on keeping on. Treat each other well, and have a great one.